Okay, we're in business. Here we go. Okay, we're going to get into the last chapter of Nehemiah today. And with Suresh ministering to us next week, I expect to finish Nehemiah either the week after or the next week. If it's the week after, we'll start Romans on Palm Sunday, which is April 14th. And if it takes me 2 more weeks to finish Nehemiah, we'll start Romans on Easter Sunday, April 21st. So that's pretty exciting, don't you think? Well, I'm excited anyway. But first, let's finish Nehemiah. Again, these were for the announcements of the Franklin Graham event. Next big thing is April 1st, the prayer meeting at North Syracuse Baptist. David Jeremiah is coming on April 9th. You've seen that. And, of course, the New Hope prayer we've already talked about. I will add, though, that the New Hope situation, as I've said before, I believe Satan is after New Hope. It is under attack. The flood is further evidence of that. And I think this court case, it would be a real thorn in the side of Satan's plans to increase abortion, make it more acceptable. As you see, it's getting more and more acceptable every day. But as it gets more acceptable, these events like it that are occurring in Times Square, where ultrasounds of a baby will be broadcast throughout Times Square, that is not pleasing to Satan. Because the more people understand about the process, the less popular it will be. So please continue to pray for New Hope. Okay, well, we've seen the compiler of Nehemiah sort of depart from the normal chronology that we've seen throughout, or at least that I've taken you throughout the book in the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, we went from their establishing the new culture in Jerusalem, which required the wall. We're going to talk a lot about that today, even more about it today. It's a very significant event. They went from completion of the wall and establishing the culture after that to 2 lists. One was a list of who lived within the walls of Jerusalem once they were completed and secure. And the second, in the beginning of chapter 12, was a list of the priests and Levites who had served Jerusalem from the time of Zerubbabel up until the time of Nehemiah. These things reminded us, these lists remind us of how much God knows about each and every one of us, right down to the number of hairs on our head in each day of our life, not just now, but 50 years ago, 20 years ago. God has that level of detail on each and every one of us. And last week we looked carefully at how they dedicated the wall. Everything completed. Everything was just as Nehemiah had been told by God to set up, and it was working, and they dedicated it, lifting it up with music. And wasn't it great to have Judy and Bob leading the music again this morning? Praise God, after a triple bypass. Good to have you back, Bob. But last week we looked at music and how it pleases God. Not only did they play music, they sang. God heard their singing, and they walked around the perimeter of the wall. And it was a wonderful expression of gratitude to God, an expression that we all need to keep in mind, that not only do we sing, not only does God hear our singing, but we move, we take action, and that pleases God as well. That was a massive, massive project, and it was done, and it was pleasing to God and Nehemiah as well. God honors music. He loves to hear music, and we should lift it up to him, knowing that it does so. So with the wall finished, the culture established, and the residents of Jerusalem settled both inside and outside the wall. Remember, they had to draw lots to see who had to live inside. I love that. Well, you would think this final chapter must be a happy ending, right? Well, if you want a happy ending, you probably want to walk out now. Because it doesn't end well. Because human nature takes over. And the lesson that we'll see in the last chapter of Nehemiah is that when you leave things to man, things will go wrong. Nehemiah 13, verses 1 through 14 are the verses we're going to take on today. Nehemiah 13, verses 1 through 14. On that day they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. Now prior to this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. But during all this time, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. After some time, however, I asked leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the rooms, and I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" Then I gathered them together and restored them to their posts. All Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. In charge of the storehouses, I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites. And in addition to them was Hanan the son of Zaccur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. Well, again, I often like to point out, if you're reading this on your own as part of your own personal Bible study, you might just read on and just say, oh, that's all interesting, and move on. But there is so much happening in these verses that it's just fascinating. But first, it's important to remember the context of where chapter 13 picks up, and we remember the context by looking back to the last verse of chapter 12, Nehemiah 12:47. This is the last verse we read last week. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers. And they set apart that which was for the Levites. And the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. So what this verse is saying is that while Zerubbabel and Nehemiah were in charge, things were going great. They were going exactly the way the Lord wanted them to go. Things were so good, in fact, that Nehemiah thought it was time to return to King Artaxerxes. He was done. The singers and the gatekeepers were getting what they needed to continue their ministry to God. The Levites were getting what they needed to continue their ministry to God. And the priests, the sons of Aaron, as Nehemiah puts it, got what they needed so they could continue their ministry to God. All of them provided by the people who, with dedication, as they promised to do, were giving to the church so that it could sustain all of these activities. But what the